I let my brother stay at my place to get back on his feet. But months turned into years. So, I finally took control and forced him out for good. Please, Julian, it's just for a few weeks. Until I find my footing. You're my brother. The only family I have left in this cold world. Those were the words Marcus used when he stood on my doorstep 3 years ago, shivering in a cheap suit that didn't fit the damp chill of a London autumn. I looked at his desperate eyes, then back at the quiet, sun-drenched hallway of the home I had spent 40 years maintaining. It was a house built on silence, old books, and the scent of Earl Grey, a sanctuary I had earned through decades of tireless service to the crown and a career that few knew the true depth of. My heart, perhaps softened by the weight of my own solitude after my dear Elena passed, betrayed my better judgment. I stepped aside and let him in, never realizing that I was inviting a parasite into my peace, or that the man I shared blood with would eventually treat me like a disposable relic in my own home. You see, there is a particular kind of cruelty that grows in the heart of the entitled. It starts small, like a speck of dust you ignore, until it becomes a mountain that blocks the light. For Marcus, the few weeks turned into months, and the months bled into years. At first, he was helpful, or at least he pretended to be. He would offer to clear the table or comment on how lucky I was to have such a quaint little property in such a prestigious neighborhood. But as his comfort grew, so did his condescension. He saw my modest clothes, the tweed jackets I'd worn for 20 years, and the comfortable loafers that had seen better days, and he mistook my frugality for poverty of spirit. He looked at my silence and saw weakness. He looked at my routine and saw a man who had been bypassed by time, unaware that the world he lived in was built by hands exactly like mine. The atmosphere in the house shifted from a sanctuary to a battleground of subtle insults. Marcus began to invite his business associates over young, loud men in flashy suits, who spoke in the jargon of venture capital and disruption. They would sit in my mahogany-paneled study, the one Elena and I had spent years curating, and leave rings from their expensive scotch on the antique wood. They would look at me as I entered to offer them tea, not as the master of the house, but as a ghost haunting the corridors of a museum. "Thanks, old-timer," Marcus would say with a smirk, dismissing me before his friends. "My brother is a bit of a traditionalist," he'd tell them, his voice dripping with a pity that felt like a slap. "He's lived in this bubble so long he doesn't realize the world has moved on. He's lucky I'm here to keep an eye on things." I remember one afternoon specifically, a gray Tuesday, when the rain was drumming rhythmically against the leaded glass windows. I was sitting in the garden room, reading a first-edition manuscript that a friend from the ministry had sent me for review. Marcus walked in with a woman I didn't recognize, a sleek, sharp-featured person who looked at my home like she was already measuring it for a renovation. They didn't even acknowledge me at first. They stood by the fireplace, discussing modernizing the floor plan. "We can knock this wall through," Marcus said, gesturing toward the library. "Julian doesn't use half these books anyway. It's just dead space. He's getting on in years. He'll be much happier in a smaller assisted living suite soon. This place is wasted on one man who just sits and stares at the walls." The sheer audacity of his words felt like a physical weight in my chest. He was talking about me as if I were a piece of furniture that had become too dusty to keep. I looked up from my book, my voice calm but firm. "Marcus, I believe I told you that the library is off-limits to guests. And as for my happiness, it is firmly rooted right where I am sitting." He didn't even flinch. He just laughed a hollow, mocking sound that echoed through the house I had paid for with blood, sweat, and secrets. "Don't be cranky, Jules," he said, turning back to his companion. "He's at that age where change scares him. But don't worry, I'm handling his affairs. He's basically a guest in my life now." That was the narrative he began to spin to everyone who would listen. He told the neighbors I was losing my memory. He told the delivery drivers he was the one paying the mortgage. He even had the gall to suggest to the local council that I was no longer fit to maintain a property of historical significance. To the outside world, Marcus was the vibrant, successful younger brother stepping up to care for a fading, eccentric sibling. To me, he was a thief of dignity. He would criticize the way I brewed my coffee, the way I spoke to the postman, and the way I insisted on keeping the traditions of our European heritage alive. "No one cares about the old ways anymore, Julian," he'd sneer. "Efficiency is the only language the world speaks now. You're a footnote in a book that's already been closed." I watched him systematically try to erase my presence. He moved my favorite armchair to the attic because it clashed with the aesthetic he wanted for the living room. He replaced my hand-wound clocks with digital screens that hummed with an irritating blue light. He even had the nerve to suggest I stop wearing my medals on Remembrance Day because it looked desperate and outdated. Every time he pushed, I retreated, but not out of fear. I retreated because I was observing. I was watching the man my brother had become a man who valued the price of everything and the value of nothing. I was waiting to see if there was any shred of the boy I used to protect from bullies left in that hollow shell of a man. The peak of his arrogance came during a dinner party he hosted without my permission. He had invited several high-profile developers, men who looked at our neighborhood like a carcass to be picked clean. I arrived home from a quiet walk in the park to find my dining room filled with smoke and the smell of expensive, overpriced catering. Marcus didn't even apologize. He pointed at my muddy shoes and frowned. "Julian, go through the back door. We have important people here. Try not to embarrass me with your old-world ramblings. Just go to your room and stay there. I've told them you're resting today." I stood there in the foyer, the cold air still clinging to my coat, and looked at the brother I had supported for 3 long, grueling years. One of the guests, a man with a Rolex that cost more than a small car, walked out into the hall. Glass in hand, he looked at me, then at Marcus. "Is this the help?" "Marcus. He looks a bit ragged for a place like this." Marcus chuckled, leaning against the doorframe of the room I had decorated with Elena. "Something like that? He's a charity project, family obligation. You know, he doesn't have anywhere else to go. So I let him stay in the servants' quarters. He's harmless, just a bit dim-witted these days." The guest nodded with a look of pure disgust, as if my presence were polluting the air he breathed. "Well, make sure he doesn't wander into the dining room. It's hard to discuss multi-million-dollar contracts with a beggar hovering around." I felt a spark then, not of anger, but of a cold, crystalline clarity. It was the same feeling I used to get before a high-stakes negotiation in Brussels or a sensitive briefing at the palace. It was the realization that the time for patience had passed, and the time for a lesson had arrived. I looked Marcus straight in the eye, and for a fleeting second, I think he saw a glimpse of the man I used to be. But his arrogance was a thick armor, and he quickly looked away, ushering his guest back into the warmth of the party. "Go on. Julian, bedtime," he called over his shoulder, as if he were speaking to a dog. I walked up the stairs, my heart beating with a steady, deliberate rhythm. I didn't go to bed. I went to my study, the one room Marcus hadn't managed to completely take over because I kept the door locked with a key he couldn't find. I sat at my desk, turned on the small green-shaded lamp, and pulled out a leather-bound folder. Inside were the deeds to the house, my retirement papers from the ministry, and a series of correspondences that Marcus didn't know existed. I also picked up the phone and made a single call. "Yes, it's Julian," I said when the voice on the other end answered with immediate deference. "I think it's time we moved forward with the cleanup we discussed. I've been a bit too indulgent, I'm afraid." As I sat there, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter and the clinking of glasses downstairs, I realized how much Marcus had underestimated the old man in the tweed jacket. He thought he was playing a game of checkers, while I had been the one who designed the board. He thought he could push me out of my own life because I chose to live simply and quietly. He had forgotten that in Europe, the oldest buildings often have the deepest foundations, and the quietest men often hold the most power. He was about to find out that getting back on his feet didn't give him the right to trample on the person who gave him the floor to stand on. The night went on, and the party grew louder. I could hear Marcus bragging about a deal he was about to close, using my property as collateral, something he had no legal right to do, but something his arrogance had convinced him he could manage. He was selling my soul to pay for his vanity. I stayed in my study, surrounded by my books and my memories, feeling a strange sense of peace. The trap was set, and Marcus had walked right into it with a smile on his face. I looked at the photograph of Elena on my desk and whispered, "Forgive me, my dear." I tried to be kind, but now I must be just. By the time the last guest stumbled out of the house into the early morning mist, Marcus was riding high on a wave of false confidence. He came to my room, banging on the door, his breath smelling of gin and hubris. "Julian, wake up. Tomorrow we're starting the renovations. I've signed the preliminary papers. You're moving to that cottage in the countryside I told you about. It'll be better for your health." No arguments. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The silence was my response. He laughed and walked away, thinking he had won. He didn't know that the morning sun would bring a reality he wasn't prepared to face. You see, my friends, there is a limit to the grace one can extend. Even to family, we are taught to be patient, to be the bigger person, and to honor the bonds of blood. But blood does not give someone the right to be a parasite. It does not give them the right to strip away your history or your self-respect. Marcus thought he was the future and I was the past. He was about to learn that the past has a way of asserting itself when it is disrespected. As I watched the dawn break over the rooftops of London, I knew that this would be the last morning Marcus would ever spend under my roof. The game was over, and the master of the house was finally taking control. The next few hours would be the most difficult, and yet the most necessary, of my life. I had spent years being the kind older brother, the quiet neighbor, the fading retiree. I had played the role perfectly, so perfectly that even Marcus believed it. But as the clock struck 8, and the first of my visitors arrived at the front gate, the mask was coming off. The world sees what it wants to see, but the truth always finds a way to the surface. Marcus was about to see the real Julian, and I suspect he wouldn't like the view at all. The sun rose the next morning with a pale, cold light that stretched across the mahogany floors of my hallway like skeletal fingers. I was already in the kitchen. The kettle, whistling softly, a sound that has grounded me for 40 years. I wore my old silk dressing gown, the one Elena bought for me in Florence during our last summer. It was frayed at the cuffs. And to Marcus, it was just another sign of my decline. He stumbled into the kitchen an hour later, his eyes bloodshot, his skin the color of old parchment. He didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he looked at my tea service, the fine bone china I've kept since my days at the embassy, and scoffed, still playing at being a gentleman. "I see," he muttered, reaching for the carafe of coffee he'd left half full and cold from the night before. "You know, Julian, that's your problem. You're obsessed with the packaging of a life you can no longer afford. It's pathetic. Really. Watching you polish those silver spoons when you haven't got 2 pennies to rub together without my help." He leaned against the counter, his presence like a stain on the quiet morning. I didn't look up from my tea. I've learned that when a man is shouting at the world, it's usually because he's afraid the world is finally listening. I simply took a sip, the warmth of the Darjeeling, a sharp contrast to the ice in his voice. By 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. It wasn't the postman or a neighbor. It was a man named Sterling, a name that sounded like it belonged to a brand of cheap silverware, though he wore a suit that tried very hard to convince you otherwise. Marcus practically tripped over himself to open the door. Sterling was the developer I'd seen the night before, the one who looked at my home like it was a plot of dirt waiting for a bulldozer. They stood in the foyer, talking loudly about open-concept living and maximizing square footage. They spoke as if I weren't standing right there, adjusting the portrait of my grandfather that hung by the stairs. "We'll need to gut this entire wing," Sterling said, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "The foundation is solid, but these walls, they're suffocating. And the wallpaper, it's like a funeral parlor in here." Marcus nodded eagerly, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I told you, Sterling, my brother has no vision. He's lived in this cave for so long, he thinks the shadows are his friends. But don't worry about him. The papers are being finalized. He'll be out by the end of the month. I've found a charming little facility for him near the coast. Lots of fresh air for his condition." He tapped his temple significantly, a gesture meant to imply I was losing my mind. I felt a coldness settle in my stomach, but it wasn't fear. It was the absolute, unwavering certainty that Marcus had crossed a line from which there was no return. To lie to a stranger about my mental health in my own home was a betrayal that transcended mere greed. It was an assault on my very identity. I walked toward them, my steps silent on the Persian rug. "Mr. Sterling, is it?" I asked, my voice as smooth as aged cognac. The man looked at me with a mixture of boredom and irritation. "Julian, please," Marcus interrupted, his voice tight. "Go back to your room. We're discussing business. Important business." I ignored Marcus and kept my eyes on the developer. "You are interested in the heritage of this house, I assume. Or perhaps you are unaware that this structure is a Grade 2 listed building. Any gutting you intend to do would require a level of bureaucratic approval that I suspect your firm is ill-equipped to handle." Sterling's eyes narrowed. He looked at my old dressing gown, then at Marcus. "I thought you said you had this under control." "Marcus, I don't have time for senile ramblings about heritage." Marcus turned on me, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "Shut up. Julian, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm the one handling the estate now. You're just a guest. A guest I'm tired of hosting." The tension in the room was a living thing, a coiled spring, ready to snap. Marcus took a step toward me, his hand raised as if to usher me away like a disobedient child. "Go. Upstairs." Now, I stood my ground. I have faced down dictators and navigated the most treacherous waters of European diplomacy. A petulant younger brother with a hangover was hardly a threat. "I believe you are mistaken, Marcus," I said quietly. "This house has never been the estate. It is my home, and I suggest you remember that before you invite vultures into our nest." Marcus laughed, a jagged, ugly sound. "Your home? You can't even pay the heating bill without me. You're a ghost, Julian, and it's time you vanished." They left shortly after, Marcus whispering apologies to Sterling as they walked to the car. I watched them from the window, my heart heavy with a grief I hadn't felt since Elena's funeral. It is a terrible thing to realize that the person you share a childhood with has become a stranger who wishes for your disappearance. I spent the afternoon in my study, surrounded by the ghosts of my past. I looked at the medals Marcus wanted me to hide: the Distinguished Service Order, the tokens of a life spent in the shadows, protecting the very culture he was so eager to sell for a commission. He saw an old man in a frayed robe. He didn't see the architect of treaties that still held the continent together. As the evening approached, Marcus returned, but he wasn't alone. He had brought a locksmith. My heart hammered against my ribs as I heard the heavy boots on the porch. "Change the locks on the study and the master bedroom," Marcus commanded. "I'm tired of him locking himself away like he's the king of England. If he wants to live here for his final weeks, he'll do it on my terms. No more secrets." The locksmith, a young man who looked uncomfortable with the task, hesitated. "Sir, is this your property?" he asked, looking at the nameplate on the door. Marcus snapped. "I told you, I'm the executor. Just do your job or I'll find someone who will." I walked out into the hallway, my coat on this time, my hat in my hand. I looked at the locksmith, a boy who couldn't have been more than 25. "Young man," I said, my voice carrying the weight of authority that I usually kept tucked away, "I would advise you to check the deed before you proceed. It would be a shame for your career to end over a trespassing charge." The boy looked from me to Marcus, his confusion growing. Marcus was livid. "Don't listen to him. He's confused. He thinks it's still 1,985. Julian, get out of the way." He reached for my arm, his grip tight and disrespectful. That was the moment I realized that Marcus didn't just want the house. He wanted to break me. He wanted to see me crawl, to see me admit that I was nothing without him. He wanted to erase the big brother who had always been the golden child, the one who had succeeded where he had failed. Every criticism of my clothes, every comment about my outdated values, every insult flung at me in front of his friends. It was all an attempt to bury his own inadequacies under the weight of my supposed decline. But he had forgotten one thing. A man who has spent his life navigating the shadows knows exactly how to light a fire when the time is right. I didn't fight his grip. I simply looked down at his hand on my sleeve. "You should let go, Marcus," I said, my voice a whisper that somehow cut through his rage. "For your own sake," he sneered, but he did let go, emboldened by what he perceived as my submission. "That's better. Now, go for your little walk. By the time you get back, this house will finally be run by someone with a pulse." I didn't say a word. I walked out the front door, the cool evening air a blessing on my face. I didn't go to the park. I walked 3 blocks over to a small, nondescript office where a man was waiting for me. Inside the office, the air smelled of old paper and expensive tobacco. An old friend, Arthur, sat behind a desk, piled high with files. He looked up as I entered and sighed. "You've been more patient than I would have been, Julian. Most men would have thrown him out the first week." I sat down, the familiar creak of the leather chair. A comfort. "He's my brother, Arthur. I wanted to give him a chance to find his dignity, but it seems he prefers to steal mine." Arthur nodded, pulling a thin, blue folder from the top of the pile. "The audit is complete. It's worse than we thought. He hasn't just been living off you. He's been using your name to secure loans. He's leveraged himself to the hilt, using this house as a guarantee." The betrayal stung, but it didn't surprise me. Marcus had always been a gambler, a man who believed the next big win was just around the corner. "And the legal standing?" I asked. Arthur smiled, a thin, sharp expression. "The house was never part of any estate he could touch. It was placed in a private trust the day you retired. Julian, only you have the key. And as for his power of attorney, well, we both know those documents he had you sign while you were grieving were as fraudulent as his business deals. I've already contacted the High Court. They're ready when you are." I sat in silence for a long time, watching the rain begin to streak the windows. I thought about the little boy who used to hide behind my legs when the lightning crashed. I thought about the brother I had tried to save, time and time again, only to be bitten by the very hand I held out in kindness. The European way is often one of quiet endurance, of preserving the past, even when it's painful. But there comes a point where the past must defend itself. "Do it, Arthur," I said finally. "Bring the hammer down. I want him out, and I want the record cleared." I walked back to the house under the cover of a black umbrella. The lights were blazing in every room. Marcus's signature move, a waste of energy he never paid for. I could hear music thumping from the living room, a modern, soulless beat that felt like a heartbeat in a body that wasn't mine. I didn't go in through the front door. I went to the small side entrance, the one that led directly to my study. I locked the door behind me and sat in the darkness, listening to the man who shared my blood celebrate a victory he hadn't yet realized was a defeat. Marcus thought he was the master of the house. He thought he was the one with the power, the one with the future. He looked at me and saw a relic, a man who had been surpassed by the efficiency of the modern world. He didn't realize that in this house, In this neighborhood, and in the world I had built, efficiency was nothing compared to integrity. He was building his castle on sand, while I was sitting on the bedrock of 40 years of service. He had no idea that the senile old man he was so eager to discard was the only thing standing between him and total ruin. Tomorrow, the visitors would arrive. Not the developers with their blueprints of destruction, but the men in dark suits, with the authority of the law behind them. Marcus would finally get the change he was so desperate for. But it wouldn't be the one he expected. He would learn that you cannot build a life by tearing down someone else's. He would learn that the old ways he mocked honor, respect, and the sanctity of home were the very things that kept the world from falling apart. And as I closed my eyes, I knew that the silence of the morning would be the loudest thing he had ever heard. For those of you watching, perhaps you have a Marcus in your life. Perhaps you have someone who looks at your age or your quiet nature and thinks you are a target. They think that because you don't shout, you have nothing to say. They think that because you value the past, you have no place in the future. But remember this, the strongest trees are the ones with the deepest roots. And when the storm comes, and it always comes, those who have no roots are the first to be swept away. I stayed in my study that night, the rain a constant companion. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt a profound, weary sadness. I had tried to be the harbor for my brother's storm, but he had tried to sink the ship that saved him. Now, there was only the cold logic of consequence. The stage was set for the final act. The twist was coming, and when the light finally hit the truth, the world would see Marcus for what he truly was, and they would see me. Not as the ghost he wanted me to be, but as the man I have always been. The morning light would bring more than just a new day. It would bring a reckoning. Marcus would wake up thinking he was the king of the castle. But by noon, he would find himself a stranger in a house that no longer recognized him. I took one last look at the photo of Elena, her smile a reminder of why this house mattered so much. It wasn't about the wood or the stone. It was about the life we had built together, a life Marcus had tried to treat as a commodity. Rest easy, my love. I whispered into the dark. The house is safe, and the master is back. Wait until you see what happens when the first knock on the door comes tomorrow morning. It wasn't the locksmith, and it certainly wasn't the developers. It was someone Marcus never expected to see, someone who would change the course of his life forever. The game is about to get very, very interesting. The clock on the mantelpiece struck 10, its chimes echoing through the house with a resonance that felt like a tolling bell. Downstairs, the front door swung open with a violent thud. I could hear Marcus's voice, loud and abrasive, filled with the false bravado of a man who thinks he has finally conquered his betters. In here, gentlemen, don't mind the clutter. The old man's things will be on the curb by noon. We've got a tight schedule if we want to get the surveyors in before the weekend. I stood at the top of the grand staircase, still wearing my old tweed jacket, the one Marcus had called a homeless man's uniform just days prior. I watched as he led Sterling and two other men into the foyer. They were carrying rolls of blueprints and high-end measuring equipment, their eyes scanning my walls like they were looking at a carcass to be butchered. Marcus looked up and saw me. A sneer curled his lip, his eyes bright with a malicious sort of triumph. Still here? Julian, I told you to have your bags packed. The car for the retreat will be here in an hour. Don't make this difficult in front of my business partners. Sterling stepped forward, tapping a pen against his palm. Listen, Mr. Beaumont, he said, using my last name with a condescending edge. We've got the permits. We've got the backing. This house is a relic of a dead era. And frankly, you're just in the way of progress. Marcus has been very generous with you, but the clock has run out. He signaled to one of his assistants to begin marking the walls with blue painter's tape, a literal blueprint for the destruction of my history. I didn't move. I didn't raise my voice. I simply rested my hand on the polished oak banister. Mr. Sterling, you mentioned permits. I find that fascinating, considering the Preservation Society hasn't held a hearing on this property in 20 years. And Marcus, you mentioned a retreat. I assume you mean the one you've been researching on my computer, using the password you thought I hadn't noticed you watching me type. Marcus laughed, but it was a nervous sound now. It doesn't matter how I found it. Julian, the paperwork is signed. I have your signature on the power of attorney from when you were sick last winter. This house is legally under my control. You're finished. You're just a lonely old man in a big, empty house, and I'm the one bringing it into the 21st century. He turned to the men. Ignore him. Start in the library. Throw those dusty old books in the bin if they aren't worth anything. As they moved toward the library, the room where I had spent 40 years of my life, the room that held the letters, Elena and I had exchanged across borders. Another knock came at the door. Not a frantic one, but 3 slow, measured strikes that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Marcus rolled his eyes. Who the hell is that now? More of your old guard friends coming to say goodbye. He marched to the door and yanked it open. We're busy. Whatever you're selling, we aren't. The words died in his throat. Standing on the porch were four men in dark, impeccably tailored charcoal suits. At the front was Sir Alistair Thorne, a man whose face was a staple in the high halls of European law and a personal friend of 30 years. Behind him stood two officers from the Metropolitan Police's Financial Crimes Unit, and a man carrying a very heavy, very official-looking briefcase. The air in the foyer suddenly felt very thin for Marcus. "May I help you?" Sterling asked, stepping forward, his big city developer persona faltering in the presence of actual authority. Alistair didn't even look at him. He looked past the chaos, straight up the stairs at me. "Good morning. Julienne, I hope we aren't too early. You mentioned there might be some domestic disturbances to attend to." I walked down the stairs slowly, each step a testament to the weight of the truth. "Not at all. Alistair, you're right on time. My brother was just explaining how he's the new master of the house." Marcus found his voice, though it was an octave higher than usual. "Alistair Thorne, from the High Court? What is this? Julienne, what have you done?" I reached the bottom of the stairs and stood face to face with the man who had tried to erase me. "I haven't done anything. Marcus, I've simply allowed you to reveal who you truly are. You see, you've spent 3 years treating me like a fool because I wear old clothes and enjoy a quiet life. You thought my silence was senility. You thought my kindness was weakness." I turned to Sterling. "And you, Izar, you were so eager to gut this house. Did it never occur to you to check who actually owns the land it sits on? Because if you had, you would have found that this property doesn't belong to me, nor does it belong to any estate Marcus could touch. It is held in a sovereign trust, of which I am the sole lifetime trustee and the chairman of the board." Alistair stepped forward, opening the briefcase. "And as for that power of attorney Marcus mentioned, we've had a forensic team look at the digital timestamps. It appears, Marcus, that you attempted to authorize those documents while Julian was legally under the care of a physician who has already testified that no such meeting took place." The color drained from Marcus's face so fast I thought he might faint. "Julian, wait. I was just trying to help. I wanted to make sure you were taken care of." He reached out, his hand trembling, but I stepped back. The mask of the pitiful brother was gone, replaced by the reality of a cornered predator. The police officers stepped into the foyer. "Mr. Marcus Beaumont," one of them said, "we have questions regarding several high-value loans taken out in the name of the Beaumont Trust, as well as allegations of identity fraud. You'll need to come with us." Sterling, seeing the ship sinking, began to back away toward the door. I had no idea. Marcus told me everything was above board. "We haven't started any work. We were just looking." Alistair looked at him with a gaze that could freeze the Thames. "Mr. Sterling, your firm's involvement in this acquisition will be scrutinized by the Heritage Commission starting at noon today. I suggest you find a very good lawyer and leave the blueprints. They are now evidence in a criminal conspiracy." Sterling fled, his assistants tripping over their own feet to follow him, leaving their blue tape peeling off the walls like shedding skin. I looked at Marcus. He looked small. For all his talk of disruption and modernity, he was nothing but a frightened child who had tried to steal his brother's life because he couldn't build his own. "Why?" "Julian," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm your brother. Why would you do this to me?" I looked at him, and for the first time in years, I felt no pity, only a deep, profound sense of justice. "Because, Marcus, you didn't just try to take my house. You tried to take my dignity. You insulted my wife's memory. You treated the heritage of our family like trash to be sold. Blood makes us related, but loyalty makes us family. You haven't been family for a very long time." The officers led him toward the door. He didn't fight. He walked with his head down, the flashy suit he'd worn to impress his associates, now looking cheap and wrinkled in the harsh morning light. As he reached the threshold, he stopped and looked back at the house he thought he had won. He looked at the mahogany, the books, the old clocks he had mocked. For the first time, he saw them for what they were, the symbols of a life lived with integrity, a life he would never understand. "One more thing, Marcus," I called out. He paused. "The retreat you found on my computer. It's a real place. It's a monastery in the north. I've already paid for your first 6 months of reflection. Once your legal troubles are sorted, I suggest you go there. You need to learn how to be a guest in a world that owes you nothing." He didn't respond. The door closed behind him. And for the first time in 3 years, the house was silent. A true, deep, peaceful silence that belonged only to me. Alistair stayed for a cup of tea. We sat in the library, the very room Marcus had wanted to destroy. "You handled that with your usual grace." "Julian," Alistair said, sipping from the bone china. But you could have stopped him months ago. Why wait until he brought the developers in? I looked out the window at the garden, where the first buds of spring were starting to show. Because, Alistair, people like Marcus don't learn from a warning. They only learn when the floor they think they've stolen falls out from under them. I wanted him to see exactly what he was throwing away. As I sat there, I realized that the house felt different. It didn't feel like a museum anymore. And it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like home. The old man in the tweed jacket was still here, and the disruptors were gone. I looked at the medals on my desk, the ones Marcus told me to hide. I polished the one from the ministry, the silver shining in the afternoon sun. I wasn't a footnote in a closed book. I was the author of the next chapter. You see, my friends, the world often mistakes kindness for weakness and tradition for obsolescence. They think that because we move a little slower or value the things of the past, we are easy to bypass. But there is a power in endurance. There is a power in knowing exactly who you are and where you stand. Marcus forgot that he was a guest, not just in my home, but in the life I had built. He forgot that the beggar he looked down upon was the one holding the keys to the gate. I walked to the front door and turned the deadbolt, the new one the locksmith had installed before the police arrived. I stood in the foyer and looked at the blue tape Sterling had left on the wall. I slowly peeled it off, inch by inch, until the wall was clean again. The scars of the last 3 years were still there, but they were healing. The parasite was gone, and the host was stronger than ever. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the floor, I felt a sense of satisfaction that no amount of money could buy. It was the satisfaction of justice. It was the knowledge that I had protected my heritage and my peace. For all of you watching who feel like you are being pushed aside by the Marcuses of the world, hold your ground. Keep your tea hot. Keep your books close. And never let anyone convince you that your age or your values make you less than powerful. The story doesn't end here, though. There is one final piece of the puzzle, a final act of grace that I had to perform to truly close this chapter. Because in the end, it's not about the revenge. It's about the peace you find after the storm. And as I looked at the letter Marcus had left on the kitchen table, a letter he thought was a final eviction notice for me, I realized I had one more lesson to teach him. A lesson about what it truly means to be a Beaumont. The silence that followed the departure of the police was not the empty, hollow silence of a lonely house. It was the deep, the resonant breath of a grand old lady who had finally had a thorn removed from her side. I stood in the foyer for a long time, watching the dust motes dance in the shafts of sunlight that pierced through the stained glass window above the door. For 3 years, that dust had felt like a failure, a sign of my own supposed decline. Now, it just looked like history settling back into its rightful place. I walked through the rooms, peeling away the blue painter's tape that Marcus's associates had used to mark the walls for destruction. Each strip I pulled away felt like a bandage being removed from a wound that was finally allowed to heal. I spent the first few days of my reclaimed life performing a series of small, quiet exorcisms. I moved the digital clocks, those humming, blue light monstrosities Marcus had insisted upon, into a box in the garage, replacing them with the rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of my hand-wound grandfather clocks. I brought my favorite leather armchair down from the attic, feeling the familiar indentations where I had sat for decades reading to Elena. I even spent an afternoon polishing the silver tea service that Marcus had mocked as useless junk. As the tarnished metal began to gleam under my cloth, I realized that Marcus's greatest mistake wasn't just greed. It was a total lack of imagination. He couldn't see the value in anything that didn't have a price tag attached to it. He saw a world of transactions, while I lived in a world of traditions. Word travels fast in a small European community, especially when the successful younger brother is led away in handcuffs. A few days later, I was out in the front garden, tending to the rose bushes that had been neglected during the years of Marcus's reign. A neighbor, Mrs. Gable, a woman who had previously looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion because of the stories Marcus had whispered, stopped at my gate. She looked at me, then at the house, and finally at the absence of Marcus's flashy sports car. I heard there was some trouble. Julian, she said tentatively. I stood up, wiping the soil from my hands, and gave her a smile that was both tired and resolute. Not trouble, Mrs. Gable, just a long overdue cleaning. It seems my brother's business ventures were built on a foundation of sand. She looked ashamed, her eyes darting to the ground. He told us. Well, he told everyone you were struggling, that you weren't quite yourself anymore. We felt so sorry for him, having to carry the burden of this place all by himself. I walked to the gate and leaned against the iron bars. In our culture, Mrs. Gable, we are taught to respect our elders, but we are also taught that the loudest drum is usually the emptiest. Marcus was very loud, but he was never the master of this house. He was a guest who forgot his manners. and I'm afraid I was a host who was a bit too indulgent for his own good. She nodded slowly, the realization of how she had been manipulated dawning on her. From that day on, the neighbors didn't look at me as a fading relic. They looked at me with a newfound, slightly wary respect. The legal proceedings against Marcus moved with the slow, grinding inevitability of European justice. It turned out my brother hadn't just been getting back on his feet. He had been running a sophisticated shell game, using my name and the Beaumont family history to lure investors into fraudulent property schemes. He had convinced himself that because I was quiet, I was oblivious. He thought that, because I didn't check the mail every day, I wouldn't notice the mounting debt he was accruing in my name. What he didn't realize was that in my years at the ministry, I had learned to read the subtext of every situation. I hadn't been ignoring him. I had been building a case, waiting for the moment his arrogance would lead him to commit an act so egregious that even the bonds of blood wouldn't be enough to shield him. 6 months later, I visited the monastery in the north, the retreat I had mentioned on that fateful morning. It wasn't a prison, but for a man like Marcus, it was a different kind of confinement. There was no internet, no flashy cars, and no audience for his lies. I found him in the garden, wearing simple linen clothes, his hands calloused from working the soil. He looked older, stripped of the bravado that had once defined him. When he saw me, he didn't sneer. He didn't even look angry. He just looked hollow. "You really did it, Julian," he said, his voice barely a whisper above the wind. "You burned it all down." I shook my head gently. "No, Marcus. I just stopped holding up the walls you were trying to tear down. You did the rest yourself." We sat on a stone bench overlooking a valley that had seen empires rise and fall. "I thought I was the smart one," Marcus admitted, staring at his dirty fingernails. "I thought you were just a ghost, a leftover from a world that doesn't exist anymore. I didn't think an old-timer in a tweed jacket could touch me." I looked at him with a sense of profound sadness. "That was your mistake. You mistook peace for passivity. In Europe, we are surrounded by things that are old. Marcus, our cathedrals, our laws, our stories, they have survived because they are built on something stronger than efficiency. They are built on integrity. You tried to sell the foundation to pay for the paint, and you were surprised when the roof caved in." I left him there with a small envelope. It wasn't money. It was a collection of letters our father had written during the war, letters about duty, about the weight of a name, and about the importance of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. "Read these," I told him. "Maybe then you'll understand why I couldn't let you stay. I wasn't just protecting a house, Marcus. I was protecting the idea of us." He didn't say thank you, but as I walked away, I saw him open the first letter. It was the last time I saw my brother as a rival. From then on, he was just a man trying to find his way back to a truth he had abandoned long ago. Returning to my home that evening, I felt a sense of completion. The twist in my story wasn't just the revelation of my power or the eviction of a parasite. The true surprise was the realization that my age wasn't a hindrance. It was my greatest weapon. I had the patience that only comes with decades of living. I had the perspective that only comes from seeing the same mistakes repeated by different generations. The world may celebrate the young and the disruptive, but it is the steady hand of the experienced that keeps the world turning. I sat in my library, the fire crackling in the hearth, and picked up a pen. I began to write my own story, not for the ministry, but for those who might find themselves in my position. To those of you watching, perhaps you are the one being overlooked at the dinner table. Perhaps you are the one whose clothes are mocked or whose routine is called boring. Do not let their lack of vision become your reality. Your value is not determined by the shine of your shoes or the model of your car. It is determined by the quiet strength you show when no one is watching, and the integrity you maintain when everyone else is taking the easy way out. The world will always try to tell you that you are past your prime. But remember this: the finest wines and the strongest oaks only reach their peak after they have endured the seasons. Your history is not a burden. It is your armor. As the final light of day faded from the room, I thought about the hook Marcus had used to try and trap me, the idea that I was lucky to have him. I realized then that the true luck was mine, but not for the reasons he thought. I was lucky to have lived a life that taught me the difference between a house and a home. I was lucky to have known a love like Elena's, which gave me the strength to stand my ground even when I was alone. And I was lucky to have a brother who, in his own twisted way, reminded me that I was still very much alive and very much in control. The old man had won, not by being loud, but by being true. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where life continued its frantic pace. I saw a young man in a suit similar to Marcus's, rushing past, his eyes glued to his phone, oblivious to the beauty of the architecture around him or the wisdom of the people he brushed past. I smiled to myself. A quiet, knowing smile. He has so much to learn. I thought, but for now, I will stay here, in my sanctuary, With my books and my clocks and my memories, the master of the house is finally at peace, and the door is locked to anyone who doesn't understand the value of the welcome. Thank you for listening to my story. If you found a piece of yourself in these words, I hope they give you the courage to stand a little taller tomorrow. Do not let the world dim your light just because it doesn't understand your glow. And remember, the most surprising thing you can be in this modern world is a person of character. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe and share your own stories of resilience in the comments below. We are a community of the experienced, and our voices are louder together than they ever could be alone. Until next time, keep your tea hot and your spirit higher.